Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is just about the top of the hour, and so we're going to give maybe 60 seconds for everyone to get logged in and connected, and we will be underway. We're so glad you could join us today. Well, hi again, everyone. Thanks for being with us and welcome to the November edition of the Hunt Institute's Early Efforts webcast. We're so glad to have you all with us today. My name is Dan Worry. I am the Senior Director of Early Learning at the Institute. And for the benefit of those of you who may be joining us for the very first time today, the Hunt Institute is the brainchild of our founder and chairman, Governor Jim Hunt, who served 4 terms as the governor of North Carolina. And we are celebrating our 20th year of service as an institute, as an education policy support to governors and state lawmakers and other senior state elected and administrative policymakers across the country. We cover the full education waterfront from prenatal on up through workforce, but on our early efforts series here, we focus in on the earliest part of that continuum, the early childhood years. And what a potentially historic time this is for early childhood. We are in the midst of a congressional conversation that could pretty radically transform the early childhood landscape in the country. The Build Back Better Act, as it is currently configured, would create universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds and dramatically expand childcare accessibility and affordability and compensation for the workforce. So an exciting time to be having a conversation around early childhood education. If you are, by the way, not the type who likes digging through 1,700 pages of federal bill text, you are in luck, because over the past couple of days, we have actually done that legwork for you, digging out all of the pertinent details on universal pre-K and childcare, and have pulled that together into a summary document that is in kind of a simplified Q&A format, and we'll plug that into the chat here in a couple minutes, but would invite you to take a peek at that at your leisure. And a perfect time for us to be having this panel discussion today. Those of you in the field certainly know that we have decades now of research documenting the long-term and the short-term effects of early childhood education, but those studies can sometimes be a little confusing. We have prominent studies that are now tracking the benefits of early childhood investment, not only out over a period of decades in the case of the Perry Preschool Project, but in their case even into a second generation now, the children of the original participants being tracked in that particular study. We also, though, have studies that have shown at different times that some of the academic benefits of pre-kindergarten, for example, seem to have what is known as a fade-out effect, right? That in the early elementary years, in some cases, we see some of those benefits start to dip, in some cases then followed by subsequent increases. And so to make sense of all of this interesting stew of research that is out there, we have assembled today a really fantastic panel. In fact, really an honor to have this conversation with this group today. And we're gonna dig into this question of what the research shows about sort of the long-term effects of early childhood intervention. Very happy to be joined today by 4 very prominent thinkers and researchers in the field. Dr. Craig Ramey is a professor at Virginia Tech University. Dr. Allison Gopnik, professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Francis Pearman is an assistant professor at Stanford University. And Dr. Robert Carr, research scientist at Duke University. First, just welcome, and it's great to have all of you together for this conversation. As we get started, I did want to note, just for sort of housekeeping purposes, two things. One is that we do plan to take some of your questions later on in the hour. And so if you will use the Q&A function there down at the bottom of the screen, you can type in your questions and we'll try to get to some of those in just a little while. Please do note also that today's session is closed captioned, and so if that is a service that would be helpful to you, you can also find the closed captioning settings down in the Zoom bar at the bottom of the screen. So why don't we go ahead and we'll kick off our conversation. Dr. Ramey, I wanted to maybe begin with you. There's actually several studies that you have been involved in here that have had even very recent publications over the past couple of months speaking to this topic. But I wanted to start maybe with the Abecedarian Project in North Carolina, which is obviously very, very near and dear to the hearts of those of us in the Carolinas and in the field. You recently published a study that is looking at the long-term effects and done some brain imaging of the participants in that study now many decades ago, and found actual sort of structural changes in the brains of the children who had received those high-quality early childhood interventions from birth to 5. Can you share a little bit about that study and what you found?
Sure. Well, as you know, the study is a randomized controlled trial, and we began it officially in 1972. And so we are on the threshold of the 50th anniversary of it. We were able to bring all of the participants to Roanoke, Virginia, to be imaged using fMRI, because we had suspected from the very beginning that if there were changes in behavior and changes in school performance, that of course that would be registered in the brain. But the technology, when we were actually implementing the program, didn't really exist to allow us to look at living brains. By the time the children now in their 40s reached that age, we could do that. And so we did. And it's very interesting to note that those particular areas that the program concentrated on, areas dealing with thinking, particularly abstract thinking, language acquisition, those are the areas that the kids who got the program looked better in than those who were in the comparison group. But what's interesting to me is that we have no way yet to take into account how much occurred during the first 5 years and what the first 5 years did to energize the way that they behaved after age 5 until they got to 40. We do know that their lifestyles differ dramatically. The kids who had the pre-K program are more likely to go to college. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher educational and levels of income and so on. They're more likely to participate in civic activities. So there is this whole cascade of influences that I hope we'll get a chance to talk about in this conversation that we're having. Because if anything, I believe we probably have underestimated the lifespan long-term effects and how the effects begin with one set of accomplishments that then facilitate other engagements and other accomplishments in some kind of a snowballing cascade kind of way. And I'll be very interested in other people's findings about that, because I think, Dan, I agree with you. We are on the threshold of being able to do something in this country that the country has been yearning for since the Mondale-Bradamus bill was vetoed in 1972. We are on the threshold of being able to provide good quality education and good quality care for the entire population. And I think it's time for us to step up to the plate and help people to get to where they want to go. And I believe that we have good reason to believe we can do that.
Dr. Ramey, thank you. I want to bring Alison Gopnik into the conversation. Dr. Gopnik, as a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, you have written and published very extensively on young children's development, including one of my very favorite books, as you know, The Scientist in the Crib. Talk to us a little bit about your work. And one of the things that I definitely wanted to make sure that you got in on this conversation, you wrote a wonderful piece in the Wall Street Journal just maybe 2 months ago that was talking about the sleeper effects of early childhood education. Share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've discovered over the last 30 years is that very young children are actually these amazing learners, and they really seem to be designed to learn. They explore, they consider possibilities, they go out into the world and figure out what the world is like, much more than grown-ups do. And one of the things that I've argued is you could think about the children as being the explorers, the R&D division, and then we take all those things that we learn and put them into action as adults. And a very interesting idea that's come out recently is that your early experiences of support on the one hand or adversity on the other hand could really shape the development of that period of exploratory childhood. So there's some evidence that adversity, for example, shortens the childhood. It means that you don't have as long a period to be in that exploratory creative state as support, having a signal that things are okay, that you can go out and explore, that you'll be taken care of. That seems to have really fairly profound effects on the whole course of development and on the brain. And so the result, which I think is really interesting, is that certainly some of the effects of early childhood interventions are the result of specific skills that children have acquired, for example. But a lot of it seems to be that if you feel as if you're supported early on, that's a cue that you're in a rich environment. And that means that you can afford to explore. You can afford to be a child. You can afford to be creative. You can afford to consider different possibilities. And we know even from work in artificial intelligence that if you have that kind of potential for imagination, creativity, and possibility, that changes what you can do as an adult. So one of the examples, for instance, is that in this recent Boston study that I wrote about, even though there weren't effects on scores in 3rd grade, though children who had been in the intervention were more likely to take the SATs. And that's an example, just deciding that you're going to do something that might be risky, that might be new, that might not be something that you start out with. That's exactly an example of this kind of imagination, creativity, and possibility that seems to come naturally to children when they think that they're in a safe, protected, nurtured, rich environment of the sort that early childhood provides.
Fantastic. And I want to, Dr. Pearman, I want to bring you in as well. And Dr. Carr, you have actually, the two of you, done some kind of similar work that looks at some of the factors that might help to sustain these early achievements. You know, I think as we're looking, it's always funny to me that there's almost an expectation, when we talk about early childhood investments, that frankly that we even need to show that decades later that this one intervention has made a difference. But as you know, there's been a lot of debate, particularly in public policy circles, kind of looking at some of this data that shows that potentially early in elementary years, and not all of the studies incidentally show this, but some studies have shown that that there may be a propensity toward a little bit of a fade out in some of those basic academic skills early in elementary school. Your research, Dr. Pearman, has looked at some of the factors that can help to sustain those effects, and wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about that.
Right. So thanks, Dan. So I'm going to talk specifically about achievement impacts, right? It's an important qualifier. So when it comes to pre-K impacts on achievement, there's generally two key findings, right, that there's general consensus on. The first is that when it comes to achievement, pre-K has strong positive impact on kindergarten readiness, right? And that finding has been consistent over time. All of the best experimental, quasi-experimental studies that have been done recently have found the same finding. That is, children who attend pre-K are academically speaking ready to take advantage of all, or at an advantage relative to their peers who don't attend pre-K. In terms of taking advantage of all of the assets and opportunities and resources that schooling has to offer. And that's no small thing. When we talk about the reasons to invest in early childhood investment, the fact that children are more ready for kindergarten is a positive thing in and of itself, right? Now the other finding that there's general sort of mounting consensus on when it comes to achievement is that those positive impacts at the end of pre-K on kindergarten readiness generally fade over time. That is, by the time children sort of advance through kindergarten and into the early years of elementary school, the relative advantage, academically speaking, that children who attended pre-K have on their peers who did not attend pre-K, that advantage generally goes away. And how folks have generally talked about that general sort of trajectory or sequence of impacts is through the framing of fade out, as you referred to, Dan. That is, over time, the effects of pre-K on achievement generally fade. Now there's also sort of a spin-off of that in that scholarship of folks who are sort of interested in the opposite of fade out, that is the conditions under which effects on achievement, that is effects of pre-K on achievement, actually continue over time. This is work by Drew Bailey and others who have sort of worked to popularize this notion of sustaining environments. That is the idea that children who attend pre-K, the effects on achievement that those children experience are more likely to persist over time if they experience in years subsequent to pre-K high quality learning environments, right? And there's quite a bit of intuitive appeal for that theory, right? I mean, one wouldn't necessarily expect academic benefits to persist if children who attended pre-K go on to kindergarten classrooms where teachers are perhaps directing instruction toward children who didn't attend pre-K, or perhaps go to classrooms or attend schools where level of instructional quality is low, right? Now, despite and then sort of conversely, one would more likely expect the effects to persist if children, attend these sort of higher quality learning environments in the years subsequent to pre-K. Now, what's interesting is that scholarship, despite the intuitive appeal behind it, there's not a whole. The evidence is pretty mixed on the value or the extent to which sustaining environments is actually the in operation. So one critique or one one way to understand some of these findings is that most of the work in sustaining environments is generally looked at the quality of learning environments in a very sort of narrow sense, or in the sense of sort of understanding quality as measured by school quality or teacher quality, for instance. Now, in a recent study, we sort of took that one step further and said, well, maybe it's not necessarily exposure to subsequent quality in any one measure, but maybe it's sort of the joint distribution of quality across both teachers and schools, right? And the reason behind that is that we know that just because a child attends a high quality elementary school doesn't necessarily mean that he or she has a high quality teacher. Right. Likewise, just because a teacher attends has a high quality teacher doesn't necessarily mean that child is attending a school where there's a culture of achievement, where there's leadership that casts a vision for school success and can support its teaching force, right? So in a recent study, along with my colleagues Dale Farron, Mark Lipsey, Matt Springer, and Walker Swain, we looked specifically at that at that phenomena that is sort of measuring sustaining environments in this sort of multidimensional way, using data from the Tennessee Voluntary Pre-K experiment, which many folks are familiar with, which had a sort of a sequence of findings that maps onto the same sort of pattern that I was describing earlier. That is, as it relates to fade out, that is strong positive impacts at the end of on achievement that faded by the time children were in third grade. And what we found within this work is that whereas sort of when we understand main effects, there's this sort of fade out with regard to a main effect of pre-K on achievement in third grade, there was actually a subpopulation of children for whom these effects actually did persist all the way to third grade. And those were children who not only attended high quality schools, but also had multiple highly effective teachers during those intervening between kindergarten and third grade. Now, there's two sort of key points in this general finding. One is that we didn't find effects that persist for children who attended either high quality schools or had high quality teachers. It was the joint distribution that really mattered. That's the first key point. The second key point is that despite sort of the optimism that comes from these findings, roughly 9% of children in the entire sample were had subsequent learning environments that would that sort of fit this high quality sort of joint distribution sort of understanding that I'm mentioning. That is, 9% of children in the sample attended high quality schools and had multiple highly effective teachers, right? So if we're talking about 9% of children who were sort of exposed to subsequent learning environments that we might reasonably expect to sustain pre-K effects, 90%, 9 out of 10 children did not, right? So what that suggests, we're really serious about maximizing pre-K impacts on achievement, right? Attending to early childhood care and quality is certainly important, but likewise, we need to be paying just as much attention to how quality is arrayed in the years immediately following pre-K as well.
Which makes perfect sense too, that that we need high quality instruction to persist for kids, and high quality experiences to persist for them across multiple years. Robert, want to bring you in. I know we you have just published as a Duke Research Fellow of ours at the Hunt Institute here this year a brief on this topic that sort of weighs in on this question of fade out. What would you add to the conversation based on your research?
Sure. And thanks so much, Dan. Thanks for the opportunity to share this work. So yeah, certainly my work is very similar to that of Dr. Pearman's because I have focused on studying the academic convergence phenomenon. Initial effects, strong evidence of initial preschool effects at kindergarten entry that appear to fade out as the test scores of children converge or catch up over time. But then also a strong body of evidence of work by folks like Craig Ramey that show that there are persistent impacts on adult educational attainment outcomes, such as high school graduation, college attendance, and SAT taking that Allison mentioned as well. This phenomenon may seem very discouraging to some folks, but other folks might wonder, why does it even matter if preschool effects on reading and math skills disappear during school, so long as those benefits persist into adulthood in the form of higher rates of high school graduation or college attendance. Let me just first try and make the case for why I think this academic convergence and fade out or catch up phenomenon matters and why I think it should be worthy of our attention. So first and foremost, the achievement gaps we see in early childhood are too large to be ignored. And I'm very encouraged that high quality preschool programming can reduce those achievement gaps in the short term. But those achievement gaps continue to persist throughout school. And I wonder, why can't the benefit of preschool education persist as well? And maybe even those long-term effects we see on higher rates of high school graduation and college attendance, maybe those would be even bigger if the preschool benefit could last throughout school. And that's why I have focused on trying to solve this convergence puzzle. And I think it's one of the most pressing challenges facing educators today. Like Francis, I have focused on studying factors related to elementary schools and classrooms that might enable the preschool benefit to last. And in particular, I have focused my research on the kindergarten year because that is when this academic skill convergence appears to be most pronounced. In 3 separate studies, my colleagues and I have found evidence that higher quality educational environments in kindergarten can enhance the preschool effect. 2 of those studies found that kindergarten teachers who provided higher quality interactions with children helped to sustain the preschool boost. In particular, interactions that were warm, sensitive, and emotionally supportive, in addition to being high in instructional support as well. A separate study of mine also found that broader measures of school quality also help to sustain the preschool boost. This includes some of the same measures that Dr. Pearman was talking about, schools where there are a higher proportion of students in the population that demonstrate proficiency in reading and math skills, and schools where students are showing higher rates of growth in those skills as well. All 3 of these studies lend some support for this sustaining environments hypothesis, showing that the academic achievement benefits of preschool only persist when they're followed up by high quality educational environments during elementary school. Dr. Pearman mentioned that 10% number of kids that get the combination of high schools and high teachers as well. The likelihood of finding that today seems low. Given the findings of my work and the work of others, I do believe strongly that elementary schools make a difference in whether or not the academic benefits of preschool will persist in the long run. And in particular, I would encourage us to move forward thinking about the scope and sequence of experiences that children are having in their early grade years, in kindergarten in particular. Policies and practices can be put in place to ensure that children are experiencing continuity and high quality experiences across preschool and kindergarten. And I can talk more about that later, but for now, I'll just pause and yield my time.
Dr. Carr, I appreciate it. Dr. Ramey, I want to circle back to you and let you weigh in a little bit on kind of the conversation at this point. You know, one of the I began by asking you about the Abecedarian Project, but I definitely have noted that you have been involved in some recent research in the state of Louisiana as well, looking at the pre-K outcomes that seem to persist very strongly in that study, even into high school academic achievement. So I wanted to give you a chance to sort of weigh in on the Louisiana example, and then I wanted to ask both you and Allison to help us to sort of square this circle of we've got on the one hand we've got this research that says it's going out for decades and decades, and Allison, the kind of the sleeper effect here, but also this conundrum of what is happening in during the early elementary grades in particular. So Craig, weigh in on Louisiana and sort of what you make of this kind of conflicting nature of the research.
Two prefatory points first. One, I think we have vastly underestimated the amount of effort and resources that advantaged parents put into their children's care and education. And so the difference between disadvantaged kids and advantaged kids is a multiple. It's not a fraction. It is probably a multiple in dollars and time and camp experiences and so on. That's an important context. The other important context is that programs vary enormously in their duration, their hours per day. They vary enormously in the quality of the staff. And I think that, and I'd be very interested in other people's opinions. My reading of the literature is programs that are longer in terms of duration of day and years, and programs that have more highly qualified staff tend to produce larger and longer lasting benefits. And it's very difficult to compare many studies because in the absence of truly multi-site randomized controlled trials, we're sometimes left with trying to put together pieces of a puzzle that fit somewhat, but not as much as we would like them to fit. With respect to Louisiana, I'd made a presentation to the chief state school officers in Alaska and talked to them about what we had found. And the superintendent of Louisiana invited me to come to Louisiana, where he was trying to put together a bill to create a program for 4-year-olds, concentrating on disadvantaged 4-year-olds, and asked me if I would help. And I was very happy to do that, of course. And I've been involved in it for the last 20 years. The superintendent was also a former state legislator. And so he knew his way around the Capitol in Baton Rouge and knew how to get things done. And that was extremely helpful. He was a highly respected leader and a really very knowledgeable superintendent. He understood that he needed to put into place the strongest pre-K program that he could possibly put into place. So it went into place as a full-day program. It went into place with certified teachers who had support from the team of us from outside, as well as a major element within the Department of Education to do ongoing professional development and down to the level of being able to work directly with teachers to improve their pre-reading and other skills. And he also understood that it's important to watch what's going on as it's happening. And so there were randomized observations of classrooms using standard tools to characterize how they were performing educationally, and they did very well. What we have found is that consistent with our own literature in the Abecedarian Project, and it's now many different replicants, if you will, is that there were initial effects on academic achievement. Those effects persisted all the way out to 3rd grade, 4th grade, 8th grade, to high school. We have just prepared a paper that shows that it increases the likelihood of completing high school on time. It reduces special education placement, things that one would expect might occur from a very successful program that had constant attention and a real understanding of how difficult this task is, particularly if you're trying to sustain it. But he was able to use the data that came from it to expand the program from initially 11 parishes or counties, if you will, to the entire state. And what we found is that as the program was scaled up and included more and more and more children, so now it's including over 50,000 children a year, the same program positive results obtained. So it wasn't a flash in the pan. It wasn't something that only a highly motivated group of people could do for a short while and then they would tire out. I think it gives us some clues about elements that we need to pay very careful attention to if we expect these kinds of programs to have the effects that they are designed to have. But I go back and I will conclude with my earlier point. This effort is not for the faint-hearted, and this effort is not for the ill-prepared. You know, it took us a long time in this country to get to universal public education after it was introduced in New England, you know, in the 1600s. And we didn't have it introduced in the South as terms of universal education until actually the 1960s, if not the 70s, for everybody. So I believe that we have a task that is enormous. We have the tools and the knowledge base to push it, and that the very future of our democracy and our capitalistic competitive economy is to a large part dependent on it. I find it exciting that we can do this, and am deeply appreciative of everyone on this Zoom and the beautiful data that's been presented. And I look forward to working with people whenever and wherever we can to make a difference. But it is challenging, and we should expect that we won't get it all right the very first time we try.
Dr. Ramey, thank you. Allison, jump in.
Yeah, I think it's very important to figure out how we can sustain some of these advantages through elementary school. But I have to say, to me as a scientist, those long-term effects were really stunning and surprising. If you had asked me, I mean, in fact, I think I wrote something 20 years ago that said, well, look, you could imagine how you could get a cycle where you do better in kindergarten because you're doing better in preschool. But the idea that 20, 30 years later, you'd be less likely to go to prison, your health status would be better, your income would be better, that would have, I mean, you know, just as a scientist, if you'd asked me, I would have said, no, I don't think that's going to happen. There's all those things that can happen in between. Why would you think that 2 years of high quality preschool when you're 3 or 4 is going to affect whether or not you get cancer when you're 40? I mean, that just didn't seem plausible. But I think those studies are really sound. They've been replicated. This new study that just came out of Boston, the studies that of course Craig did all that, Dr. Amon did all that time ago. So there is evidence that there's something about, I think, about that early period and about having that kind of support in that early period that has an extra effect beyond just the fact that, you know, if you're doing something well, then you'll continue to do things well. Now, I don't want to discount that. That's really true. And the work that Francis and Robert are talking about is the ways that we can make that happen. And we have to keep having the investments all the way through. But it is interesting and promising that giving that support early on seems to have effects on the way that people are functioning, not just in academics, not just in the things that they're trained on, but in what's sometimes called these soft skills, just sort of having a prosperous life, having a sense of possibility, having a sense of alternatives, having a sense that there are things that you can do beyond just your narrow experiences. And I think the evidence for that is actually remarkably good and remarkably positive. Now, again, as Dr. Amy was saying, getting at that done just for 3 and 4-year-olds is a tremendous task, and making sure that it's done in a high quality way. And we have lots of evidence that the quality of those early experiences is absolutely essential. It's not just that you put children in pre-K, the quality of the pre-K is really important. The kind of play-based, inquiry-based pre-K programs that the Abecedarian program was a wonderful example of, those seem to be particularly important and effective, and it's hard to do that. I think we also have evidence that you can scale that up. It isn't just that it's tiny privileged programs that can do that you could do it for all of Boston, you could do it for all of Louisiana. And I think we have evidence that the effects of that are going to be really these profound long-term effects, not just on achievement or scores, but on all sorts of other aspects of what it means to have a prosperous life. And in the most recent work, I think we even know something about what the mechanisms are that might be responsible for that. So some of these kind of life history is what they're called in biology, these mechanisms about, can you afford to have a long childhood? Are you getting a signal that life is going to be short and difficult, and therefore you should just commit to doing the things that you have to do to survive, versus are you getting a signal that life is rich and people will take care of you? And even better, if, as Francis and Robert were saying, that signal is persisting through kindergarten and through elementary school, that tells you something about the range of possibilities that's open to you, the kinds of things that you can do, the ways that you can be imaginative about your life in the world. So again, it's really important to try and figure out how we can sustain these things. But I hope people don't go away with the message, oh, well, it fades away. It's really difficult. You put all this investment in. In fact, I think the message is has been surprisingly the opposite, that making these investments ends up having these much longer and broader effects than I think we would have predicted. I can ask Craig, but I think that we would have predicted even when we were starting these programs.
Well, certainly we did not expect some of these things we found. We weren't able, I was 26 when I started the Abecedarian Project. I certainly wasn't thinking 50 years ahead. But what I think we as developmentalists need to have a better appreciation for is how the individual is a co-maker of his or her experiences. They bring certain things to the situation. Certainly the quality of the environment in which we are embedded, the quality of the school system, the quality of the teaching. You can analyze this at multiple levels. But what I think we're talking about is, how do you lay the foundation for competence? And then competence gets displayed in an ever-widening array of circles, not just in the circle that's called school. I mean, school is really about preparation for life. It isn't just about doing the next multiple choice exam for the SAT. It's about, are you going to be a contributing citizen? Are you going to have a good family life? Are you going to participate as a citizen? I believe that we have reason now to broaden and deepen what it is we're looking for and to move away from simply psychometric evaluations of how people are doing, and to take the ecological approach, which I think many of us share, and understand that we can map that more precisely now than ever. And so we should be charged with upping our game, because the issues that we're facing, although they appear to be somewhat different than what we faced in the 50s, they are remarkably similar in their influence on our society as a whole. The haves and the have-nots struggle to understand one another. We do not live up as much as we would like to the ideals that the framers of our Constitution articulated. We can do better. We have done better in the past. We need to continue to do better. But we, as people who create and do research on programs, we also need to up our game to deal with this complexity. And now we have a lot of the tools to be able to do that. And I look forward to what you will contribute in the coming decades, because the possibilities are so ripe for really major discoveries about the forces that shape human development.
Francis, please.
Yeah, if I could jump in for a moment, I think there's one thing I would like to add to the conversation that has to do with this issue of scalability, right? As we're talking about investing in pre-K, what does it mean to move from a single site to multi-site to statewide to federal, a federal pre-K initiative, right? When we talk about pre-K impacts, right, we don't talk about the impacts in the abstract, right? Anytime we're talking about an impact, it's relative to some threshold, right? And that threshold is what social scientists refer to as the counterfactual condition. That is what would be expected in the absence of pre-K, right? And pre-K is generally considered beneficial when children who attend pre-K exceed whatever that threshold is, right? So as that, with that kind of frame in mind, I think there's a couple interesting things to know, right? A lot of the sort of longer term impacts that we've even discussed today, specifically around Abecedarian, preschool, and others. Those interventions, right, when they were implemented, they weren't implemented in the most affluent parts of Chapel Hill and Ypsilanti, Michigan, for instance, right? They were targeted to arguably the most disadvantaged areas in those communities, right? Communities where the counterfactual condition was arguably the lowest, right? Where the types of learning experiences that children in the absence of pre-K were very low, right? So when we talk about sort of the expanding pre-K, right, we need to be really cognizant when we're sort of providing better access to children from all sorts of communities, what we should really expect, right? And there's some work that I recently published along these same lines, which we're looking at sort of impact variation across places in Tennessee, right? And what we found is that sort of the beneficial effects of attending pre-K in Tennessee were most beneficial for children living in the most disadvantaged areas in Tennessee. Moreover, children in the most advantaged or the more affluent parts of Tennessee actually didn't experience the same benefits, right? And some of the reasons why, it's actually quite interesting. I mean, Allison was referring to, to the benefits of a sense of security, right? So part of this impact variation across places was explained by differential exposures to like crime and violence, right? So children exposed to the most crime in their communities were actually the ones most likely to benefit from pre-K, right? Which seems to speak to some of these mechanisms about why pre-K impacts the sense of security that it can provide children with otherwise sort of vulnerable and insecure sort of home environments. So I just wanted to mention that as an important sort of, as this conversation continues to move up the ranks, if you will, and we start to think about, all right, what does it mean to implement not only pre-K centers or pre-K programs with fidelity, but what about what should we be expecting out of these programs? We really need to be thinking about variation across places, because the other key point that it's important to mention as well is not only do we find that these effects were most beneficial for children living in the most disadvantaged parts of Tennessee, but those children were actually least likely to attend pre-K as well, right? So when we talk about expanding pre-K, it's not just a matter of, all right, pre-K access for all, because when we open up programs at scale, there are a lot of other mechanisms that come into play. Issues of transportation, issues of information gaps. Those become sort of barriers in access for children living in some communities. And it's not just, you know, a random set of communities. It's actually the communities where we'd expect where we'd expect the programs to be most beneficial.
Robert, as we're looking at the prospect of expanding into more of a universal 3- and 4-year-old pre-K, what do you feel like the lessons are here for public policy?
Certainly, thanks, Dan. Just want to first acknowledge somewhat of a blind spot in my own work and in this conversation as well that Craig pointed out. Convergence, fade out, catch up could be a function of the experiences that children are having in their early childhood programs, the scope and sequence of the experiences that take place between birth and age 5. The Abecedarian study was a monumental effort that took place to serve children from the time that they were born until the time that they entered kindergarten. And as Craig was right to point out, the experiences that they had in that program were of the highest quality and not for the faint of heart. I like that phrase. The studies that I work on, the early childhood programs that I have focused on testing are generally state-funded pre-K programs for children at age 4. I don't think that they compare to the experience that the children had in the Abecedarian program. Nonetheless, we see positive effects of even just a year's worth of attending a preschool program at age 4, a state-funded, publicly funded preschool program. And it's still worthy to consider the question of whether those benefits can persist. And I think my work and a lot of thinking recently has been around the scope and sequence of experiences that kids have as they flow into kindergarten in the early elementary grades. And I certainly believe that the benefits of pre-K or preschool writ large will persist in a context where preschool and K-12 education systems have been aligned in terms of their content standards, curriculum, and instructional quality. I'll point out that the National P3 Center at the University of Colorado has developed a framework to facilitate preschool through 3rd grade alignment. And a number of states have already begun to implement some programs and policies to facilitate this cross-sector alignment. North Carolina is actually one example of a state that is just beginning to implement some of these initiatives. For example, we have our state legislature created the Interagency Council to facilitate coordination between our Department of Public Instruction, where our K-12 education is housed, and our Department of Health and Human Services, where our early childhood programs are housed. We also here in North Carolina have a ground up initiative called the Pathways to Grade Level Reading, which seeks to ensure that all children in North Carolina have high quality preschool and elementary school experiences that lead to grade level reading, on track grade level reading in 3rd grade. Other states, Hawaii is a great example actually of a state that's a lot further along in terms of aligning preschool and school age education systems. And there's actually some evidence from Hawaii in that state that the implementation of this aligned system of preschool and school age education is having improved outcomes for students' academic achievement. And that's incredibly encouraging to me. I think Hawaii, North Carolina are states that we can look to as examples of ways to facilitate in policies and practices to promote the long-lasting boost of preschool education.
Robert, thank you. And I'm keeping mindful of the time. We've got not a ton of time left and a lot of audience participation and questions stacking up. So I do want to try to get to some of those. But Allison, I want to pose maybe one last question before we go to the audience Q&A, because you talked a little bit earlier, and I just wanted to give you a chance to expand a little on this question of, what are the kinds of experiences that children might be having in these early childhood programs that could be opening the door to these long-term academic effects, or I'm sorry, not academic, lifelong sort of effects. And so I guess my question is there a danger that the two are at odds? I guess, so, is there, as we look toward universal pre-K, is there a danger that we design programs so focused on achieving early academic outcomes that we may be shutting the door on some of those longer term outcomes?
Well, I think and it's still early days, we haven't worked all of this out. But as Francis was pointing out, some of these things like security, emotional sensitivity, nurturance, the kinds of things that are care, the things that caregivers do, those seem to be really important in determining what the outcomes will be like. And we often don't pay as much attention to them as we do to some of the more kind of standard academic measures, even for preschool. So, one of the things that preschool teachers are saying is we're under all this pressure to make preschool more and more like school, right? And I think what we would tend to say from the development is that that's not a great idea in terms of how well the children are going to be able to function later on. And something that I wanted to emphasize that I see in the chat is, and relevant to policy, is that it's not as if preschool is in competition with things like family allowances or other kinds of support for parents. In fact, those things are going to be symbiotic. So, the more you can support parents, and in fact, in some of the early work showed that part of the reason why something like Head Start worked well was because the parents felt empowered in a way that they hadn't felt before. So it was actually providing support for the parents. It was providing support for the community. And that support for the parents and the community in turn was providing the children with signals that they were in a safe, nurturing environment in which they could thrive. That's not to downplay the importance of having high quality schools, but I think it may very well be that some of these other kinds of factors, like the ways that parents are engaging with their children, are also responsible for these long-term kinds of effects, and are things that we should be supporting when we're thinking about the design of these programs. So something like, family allowance plus preschool is going to just multiply the positive effects on this view rather than being a sort of competition.
And Allison, you raise a question that several people have sort of brought up in the chat, so I'm going to combine a couple of different questions. But Francis, you talked and Robert have talked a little bit about the sustaining impacts of school factors as kids matriculate on up into elementary school. And the question in the chat is where do we stand in terms of research on the sustaining factors that come into play on the side of families? So, I mean, what role do families have in sustaining those high quality outcomes early on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually involved in a project right now examining that very issue, which is, so much of the sustaining environments literature has focused on school-related factors, right? And understandably so. That's where students are learning 8 hours a day. And there's this other domain that arguably has even more of an influence on children. That's their family lives. So what's interesting in this recent study, and we're simply in this study looking at impact heterogeneity on sort of kindergarten readiness, right, and looking at different measures of parental involvement, and sort of similar to the same story. And there's going to be a theme in everything that I'm talking about today, which is the children who benefit the most from are the children who need it the most. So how I arrive at that conclusion with regard to this parent study is that we can actually look at the type of parental involvement the parents were involved in during the pre-K year. And what we found was that parents who essentially mirror the type of activities that happen in pre-K classrooms, that are parents who do numeracy activities with children every day, who read with their children every day. Interestingly, those children who grew up in this household, or who were in those households, benefited less from pre-K exposure than children whose parents did very little numeracy activities, did very little literacy, right? So the children who saw the biggest boost were the children whose pre-K experiences were unique and novel relative to what they would have experienced in the absence of pre-K, right? So what I'm talking about here is not like a dynamic complementarity type of thing. It's just simply trying to identify, all right, what types of family environments, what types of were benefited the most, and essentially it was children whose parents did the least pre-K type activities for them. So what this work seems to suggest is that similar to kind of focusing on schools, we also need to be really mindful of the types of activities that parents are engaging children in, if for no other reason than trying to figure out who we should be targeting pre-K investments toward, and what we should be expecting from those investments.
Dr. Pearman, thank you. I'm sensitive that our time is getting short. We've only got a couple of minutes, and with four of you, I want to give each of you an opportunity to sort of close out. So, maybe in a short response here, maybe a minute or less a piece. As policymakers are debating this in Congress as early as this week, I guess a two-part question. Is early childhood making a difference in the long run? And what do they need to be most mindful of as they're enacting these policies? And Dr. Ramey, I'll maybe start with you.
First, we don't need to convince middle class, upper middle class, and upper class parents that preschool is important. They're into it with both feet and both arms. They stand in line to enroll their kids when the woman finds out she's pregnant. So what I don't think we've emphasized is that there are benefits to them that can go well beyond what their children will derive in terms of additional academic benefits. There are benefits to the family. We have changed the demography of this country drastically. It's now the case that the majority of women are in the paid labor force, out of the house, even for children who are 1 year of age and younger. So I think that this pre-K has a much broader appeal, but as Robert was pointing out, it has differential impact on different segments of the population. And as Francis was pointing out, and I believe that we have much more depth to say about that from our own research, as well as his research, it is the children who are most at risk who derive the biggest benefits. And whether you measure that at the level of family resources, or you measure it at the level of neighborhoods, or you can cut this in various ways. So yes, I think the conclusion is those who need it to succeed academically will benefit from it. And the research suggests that there will be a spread of benefits that society values. As a matter of fact, that Jim Heckman has used our data, among others, to argue that the return on investment is something like 7-fold, and that there's an annual internal rate of return of about 13%. Even in today's economy, 13% is what many of us would wish for. And so I believe that we have a more consistent message to convey than the public has heard for a long while. I do believe that the consistency is that this will have a positive benefit, and don't settle for something that's second rate. Mm-hmm. Other countries don't. We are the United States of America. We can do anything that we want to do if we put our shoulders to the wheel. I believe that this is a challenge for us right now, and I believe that we can rise to it.
Dr. Ramey, thank you. Robert, with the knowledge that we have a hard stop coming here quickly, closing thoughts.
It's hard to follow up on Craig there, but I'll just say the evidence is clear, is that high quality preschool programs are preparing children to enter kindergarten ready to learn. That is written into the Head Start legislation. Many states that establish state funded pre-K programs have that set as the intended goal. And I feel confident saying that we are accomplishing that our preschool programs today and for the past several decades have been successful in doing that and could be even more successful given better resources and better investments as well.
Dr. Pearman.
Yeah, so I guess I want to close by just mentioning a comment about fade out, right? So there's, we talked about sort of the problem of fade out. There's two critiques, right, that I think we should be mindful of, but the notion of fade out. One is that when we generally talk about achievement outcomes, right? And as many folks on this call have already noted, there are many more outcomes that we should be focused on aside from achievement. That's one critique of the fade out world. The other is that sort of how we talk about fade out actually could miss the point. And what I'm getting at with regard to that is, when we think about the purpose of K through 12 schooling, right? One purpose is that it is to reduce disparities that children enter school with, right? That's the reason why achievement gaps are so problematic for folks who think about equity in schooling. Is that schools should be reducing achievement gaps. Now, the irony of sort of the pre-K world is that we think that the one achievement gap that we never want to go away is the achievement gap between children who attend a pre-K and not attend a pre-K, right? But I argue that there's actually a kind of fade out that we would desire. That is the kind of fade out where children who don't attend pre-K wind up closing the gap on children who do attend pre-K, but in a context in which all children are better off as a result, right? So it's really thinking about, all right, when we talk about increasing the number of children, percentage of children who are attending pre-K, there is a possibility, there is very likely an ideal scenario in which an entire school systems are better as a result. That is, the achievement levels increase, learning ability, learning rates increase, but that could also be observed in the context of a type of fade out that is desirable. So I want to close on that.
Dr. Gopnik, I'll give you the last word.
Okay. Well, one of the things that comes out of the biology is that childhood and caregiving, that investment that we put just as human beings in taking care of those young children, has its greatest evolutionary benefits when environments are really unpredictable, when you don't know what's going to happen, when things are variable, when things change. That's when this investment of having these exploring, creative children and having people who are taking care of them, giving them just the information that they need, that's when it really pays off. And it's hard not to think that that is the world that we're in now, and it's going to be the world that we're in more and more as we go forward, that those capacities to deal with change, to deal with novelty, to deal with variability are going to be most important. And what we have increasing evidence for is that it's being taken care of when you're young by well-supported parents, particularly by preschool, that gives you the capacity to deal with change, to be resilient, to be robust, to be imaginative when you are older. And that's really, I think, one of the big, that's going to be one of the gifts that comes from this. But I think also we have a better empirical evidence for this than just about anything that we do in policy. So we might be going back and forth, but if you compare this to the benefits of building roads, or the benefits of having schools in the first place, or the benefits of almost everything that we do, the empirical evidential base for early childhood and pre-K having these good outcomes, I think is just much stronger than just about anything else. And we shouldn't de-emphasize that. So if ever we wanted to have a science evidence-based policy, this is the policy that's the science evidence-based policy.
Dr. Abecedarian.
Allison's point deserves tremendous underlining, and we are mainly academicians here, and academicians make their living by making distinctions among things. We are not as good at lumping things as we are at splitting them. The time has come, I submit, and Dan, I think that your institute could take a real leadership in this. Not that you haven't already taken leadership, but I mean, it could go to another level. We need a unified statement from the leading educators, the leading scientists, leading policy people, that is no more than 3 pages that says what we know. And for those of us who are trained as splitters, to understand that the time is ripe for a temporary statement of, we know this and we are ready to go there. And that's not the end of the journey. That's just the next mile in a journey that's been going on for almost 5,000 years.
Dr. Ramey, thank you. And I think you have just volunteered yourself for a new project that we'll work on. What a fantastic discussion. I was lamenting to myself even before this conversation started that I wished we'd scheduled 3 hours to talk to this panel, and certainly knew that would be the case and feel that way. Now, I hate that we are as short on time as we are, but I want to thank Dr. Craig Ramey of Virginia Tech University, Dr. Allison Gopnik of the University of California at Berkeley, Dr. Francis Pearman, professor at Stanford University, and Dr. Robert Carr of the Center for Childhood Family Policy at Duke University. A terrific conversation, and we are just so grateful to each of you for taking the time to participate today, and look forward to talking with all of you again soon. Thank you for taking time out of your day to tune in and participate in our conversation. We'll see everyone soon.